What's up, gangsters? It is time for a video that I have been looking forward to for a long time. Because this is going to be kind of an unusual sort of combination of testing and follow-up and product review and how-to and workbench diary all rolled into one. So how does that happen? So one of the things that I have been super frustrated with is my inability to get a really straight polish on a 2K urethane gloss clear coat. I'm really good at what I call distance polishing, which means that if you look at it from a distance, it looks great. But that doesn't satisfy me because I build my stuff to be photographed up close, and I do so much of my work with an optivisor on my face, and I can see those little micro scratches and they piss me off. And I have been practicing and struggling off and on over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years almost, to try and figure it out. And based on some good conversations with my buddy Carlos Starton, who achieves absolutely flawless, unbelievably beautiful gloss finishes on his motorcycle models, I've picked up a new product that I want to test out. And that is this stuff right here. This is Scholl's S3 Gold XXL in this gigantic bottle that I didn't know was going to be so huge. Anyway, Carlos has been telling me about this stuff, and he swears that it is fantastic. Now, I've been using rouges, and specifically, I've been using this stuff, Zam, which is a, come on, focus there. Focus on the Zam, not on me. Anyway, I've been using Zam, which, as you can see, is a rouge that you run your wheel in and then do your work with it. And Zam is pretty popular in industrial model making shops where guys have to polish like Lexan lenses that have been machined, and then they have to, turn them into something slick and shiny. And it works pretty good, and I like it because it's one step, and it doesn't make much of a mess because it's a rouge. I stopped using the liquid polishes like Novus for that reason, because it just splatters everywhere. And I know that there are other polishing compounds that people like Tamiya makes one that people seem to like, but I think it's a paste or a liquid. Same thing, Gravity Colors, they make one, but I just really like the idea of using the Zam buffing compound. I've also used these Dialux rouges, which are pretty good. They come in different grades. They're jeweler's rouges, and they work pretty good, but I kind of stopped using them because honestly I couldn't convince myself that I was doing any better with them using multiple steps than I was using a single step compound like Zam. So anyway, I thought, well, maybe the compound is the secret. But Carlos has also been talking to me a lot about how much he likes the Gravity Colors 2K urethane clear. And I've been wanting to try out their paint and also their 2K clear for a long time, and I just in the last couple of weeks have done a complete test of all of their materials. So I have these two pieces, which are done completely in the Gravity Colors system. Well, this one's got a different primer on it, but both of these have Gravity Colors color coats and Gravity Colors 2K clear urethane gloss on them. And so you could almost call this part 3 of the Gravity Colors test. So we're going to see how that works out. But Carlos also let me in on something that he's learned, which is that guys he's talked to, I guess, in the auto body industry, and I've heard this since then from other people, say that the hardener for a 2K urethane clear may expire after about 6 months, and it causes the the clear coat to never fully harden. Now, I don't know if that's exactly true or not, but as it turns out, my can of U-Pol and the accompanying can of hardener are like 2.5 years old. And I haven't felt like I was getting good polishing results for most of that time. But when I think back on it, the first time I used it and polished it was when I built my bright red MAK Falca. And I felt like I got a good polish on it. And not since then. So maybe there's something to that. Something else that Carlos has also talked to me about is that he waits for like 5 days before he polishes his clears, which is different from what I had heard elsewhere, which was that you need to do it within 24 hours or it becomes too hard. And his comment was, look, it's actually easier to flatten it, meaning cut all the orange peel or whatever with sanding when it's harder, which kind of makes sense to me. So with this 2K from Gravity, I sprayed it about 5 days ago. And sure enough, for the first 48 hours, I was actually surprised at how soft it stayed. In fact, I felt like it stayed softer for longer than U-Pol did, even with my allegedly expired can of hardener. But I've been checking it every day by doing the thumbnail test, which is basically just stabbing my thumbnail into it and seeing if I can leave a mark. I've been doing that every day for the last 5 days, and sure enough, yesterday and today, I feel like this stuff is definitely much harder. I mean, there's no doubt that it's a lot harder than it was the day or two after I sprayed it. So I feel like it's about as hard as it's going to get. I cannot put a significant ding in it with my thumbnail. So it's ready to polish, and that's what I'm going to do. And so that covers the sort of testing and review and follow-up part. And the how-to part is that I'm going to basically just carry you guys along with me as I do this, and we're going to just sort of diary live action whether or not I've been able to overcome my polishing challenges. So we'll see. Hopefully it works in my favor. Let's get started. Okay, so here we go. Now, first things first is sanding. One thing I've definitely learned is that the key to good polishing is good sanding. Because if you don't sand in a disciplined way, you'll have scratches that will be almost impossible to polish out. And Carlos assures me that that is much harder to do if your clear coat is soft. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to start at 2000 grit. And this is wet or dry sandpaper, and I'm going to use it wet. So there we go, 2000 grit, then I'm going to go to 2500, and then I'm going to go to 3000, and then I will finish the sanding with one of these Abralon pads that I have. You can see it's kind of got a cloth on it. With this spongy Velcro backing. And this is a 4000 grit pad. Now, some of you are probably immediately going, well, what about 8,000 and 12,000? Well, so the deal with that is, and this has created a lot of confusion, those grits, 6,000, 8,000, 12,000, are grits that, as far as I can tell, are invented by the people who make micro mesh sanding cloths. And I can only assume that they did that so that they sound better, cooler, finer, and they sell more. Because there are grit standards that are set by like groups like American National Standards Institute. There's actually an Abrasives Standards Institute in the United States. There's one in Europe. There's one in Japan. There's one in China. It's the same kind of thing that governs things like the grades of steel or aluminum. They are agreed upon standards so that manufacturing can be more consistent, especially when you cross borders. And so what they do is when it comes to abrasives, they define the grit based on the average particle size in microns. And I actually have a conversion chart. Actually, I'll print a copy of it out and I'll show it to you here. And what you'll see when you look at the conversion chart is that the finest grit standard goes down to about 3600, and then it kind of falls off the map, and then you can't get a whole lot smaller than that. In fact, the finest legitimate abrasive that I've seen that goes beyond 4000, like these Abralon pads, is 3M now has a 5000 grit sponge. But when you actually look at the particle size and you look at the conversion chart, you can see that the grit sizes for the 8,000, 10,000, 12,000, whatever, can't be really any finer than that. So don't get too thrown by that. If you want to use those micro mesh products, that's fine. Just be aware that you're not really buying yourself anything beyond what's available from manufacturers who use readily recognizable abrasive standards. Anyhow, that's what I'm going to do. I'm also going to do all of it by hand on one sample, but I'm also going to do some of it with my nifty little Proxxon pin sander, which is pretty cool because it can make quick work of this type stuff, and I've been experimenting with it a little bit. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this one by hand, and I'm going to do this one with the Proxxon. So let's get started. All right, here we go. Now, before I hit this with sandpaper, I just want to say that this is the surface that we're starting with. It's really pretty nice. I honestly feel like this Gravity 2K lays down with a little less orange peel than U-POL does. I mean, this is a nice surface. Now, what you have to know is that Carlos keeps accusing me of this is a kind of a less than perfect paint mule, which I did intentionally because I wanted to see how I could take a piece of plastic that was not in perfect condition. Maybe much like what the average model maker is going to have after sanding and filling and priming a car body. It's nowhere near as smooth as a plastic spoon, and that's okay to me because this represents more of a real-world test. So, and obviously since this is an airplane wing, it's got some panel lines in it, and there's a few little pieces of dust and so forth. It is not perfect. So it'll be, to me, even more interesting to see how well it manages to polish out. You can see I've got some just sort of fingerprints on it, but otherwise, when you look at it, at the reflections, it's a little bit wavy, but it's really not bad at all. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And the way that I wet sand is I just put a little bit of water right on the bench and get myself a rag handy and get after it. It's not complicated. The only thing that I would say is kind of a tip with wet sanding is go lightly and stop and wipe it down and check your work often, because you can cut through your clear coat pretty fast, especially if you have any sort of raised edges. And you definitely don't want to do that, because then that means you've got to come back and do a repair. So you just have to take it easy and just be aware of how things feel as you're working, because you can usually tell by the sound and the feel how well your abrasive is cutting, and you can definitely see it when you wipe it off, and you'll get a pretty quick idea of how far you have to go, because you can see the difference between the high spots and the low spots, just like that. It's a little tougher on a light color like that silver finish, so you just really have to move your piece around in the light a lot so that you can tell what you're doing. One thing that I know some people like to do when they wet sand is add a little bit of like dish soap to the water, you know, because they feel like that it not only helps clean the paper and clean the surface, but that it reduces the friction and makes things go better. I personally don't do that, but hey, if that's, you know, if you like to do that, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, one thing that you should do while you're working is every so often change directions and go at least a 45-degree angle to what you were doing before, because that's how you sand out the scratches from your previous pass. Okay, so in looking at this, you can see that it's still pretty wavy. And this is how you gauge your progress, because what I'm looking for is to have a uniform, flattened surface. That's how you know that you've got it straight. So you can see now that this is that I'm starting to get rid of some of that waviness right here. And this is really what your coarsest grit is for, is to flatten everything. And then the grits that you use after that are all about successively removing the scratches from what you did before. Okay, so this is starting to look pretty good. You can see that I've pretty well flattened all that area right there, with the exception of the low spots where the panel lines are. And I'm not going to attempt to flatten those completely out, because honestly, that doesn't really help the purposes of my test, and I feel like if I did, that there's a good chance I'd blow through the clear. Now, if you do blow through the clear, it's not the end of the world. You just have to stop, and you're going to have to reshoot and put another couple of layers of clear on top of it, which is not too big of a deal. You can do that. You don't get into trouble until you get into the paint. Then it becomes a really big problem, because now you're having to try and match what you did before, and I can tell you from hard experience that it's very difficult to do. So just proceed carefully, because it's much easier to just go slow and be methodical than it is to have to fix it if you do burn through. So you know, the best advice there is just don't. Okay, so one thing that you may notice when you look closely at this is that in places like this this edge right here, you can see that I've got a ridge running along the edge, and you can see it over here as well. This is something that 2K clear urethane tends to do, which is kind of, for whatever reason, pile up along hard edges like that. And that's part of flattening it, is to sand those ridges down to where they're the same level as everything else. But you've got to be careful with that, obviously, because it's pretty easy to burn through on an edge, as you can see from that tiny little white dot right there by my thumbnail, where I've gone clear through everything down to the white primer. Not a big deal on this little test part, but you have to watch out for that, obviously, on the real thing. Okay, so as you can see, I have decided to go ahead and see if I could level this out to below those, or to the depth of those panel lines, just to see what would happen if I would start to burn through. And in fact, I almost got there, but I have started to go through, and here's what that looks like. Look right here by my thumb. See right there next to that little round thing where it looks a little bit different? That's gone right through the clear and into the paint. So that's kind of good because that gives you an idea of what you've got to look out for there. So if this were the real thing, at this point, I would have gone too far. I would have to respray this and then resand this area, which, you know, wouldn't be the end of the world, but I'm not going to do it for this test piece. This is all about experimentation. So I think what I'm going to do now is, since I've gotten that far with the 2000 grit paper, that I'll go ahead and bump it up to the 2500, rub through that, and then carry on with the rest of it until I'm ready to polish it. Okay, I'm about to cut this with the 2500 grit paper, but I thought I'd show you guys this chart that I mentioned before. Okay, you can see up here this has got micro mesh columns, and then the ANSI or CAMI, which I forget what that stands for, the Euro standards. And this is how you tell what kind of paper you've got, is the way that the grit is called out on the back of it. If you're in the United States, you'll see either this regular stuff or this Euro standard stuff for the most part. I have also seen a chart that shows the Chinese standard, and I believe that that's what this stuff is, and I think it pretty closely matches the American standard. But the important part is when you look down here at the bottom, okay, see when you're getting down here, this is the American and European standards. See, they get a lot different down here at the bottom. But let's take this P2500, 9 microns. Okay, that is not even on the micro mesh chart, but look here at this 2400 that they've got. That's somewhere between 13 and 10 microns. So it's not too far off of what this is, but it's way off of what the American standard is. Because if you go to 1500 on the American standard, you're all the way down here at almost half that, at 5 microns. And that's about where you start to get into these really high micro mesh numbers. And you can see the 6,000, the 8,000, 12,000, you're getting way down here to the very bottom of the chart, where there's not even anything listed. But you can see, you can kind of fill in the blanks. If you went to a 3000 grit standard on the American scale, you'd be somewhere down here as well. So anyway, it gets a little bit confusing. It's not, obviously, there's not any direct matches, but the important point is to just understand that even though these numbers are really high on the micro mesh scale, they really don't mean all that much. Okay, so at this point, I've worked my way all the way through the 3000 grit wet or dry paper. And I think things look pretty good. One thing I've learned the hard way is that everything can be looking awesome at this point. You know, you feel like you've got a nice, smooth, satiny surface where everything looks good, and then you go to polish it and you discover that you've got tons of scratches. And that may be, in fact, what all of those are right there. Those may not polish out. I don't know. we're going to find out. But this is kind of how it goes. It's basically just a game of working your way through all of these scratches so that they are completely gone when you hit them with the polishing cloth. And you can see how as the water evaporates completely, that those show up even more. So let's see what happens when I switch to the little sponges. This is a 3000 grit sponge here. So I'm going to start with it. Okay, so I used some air to really force that dry, and you can see, things look pretty good. Looks like I may have a few deeper scratches, and what's interesting is that they show up when I look at this through the display on my camera lens, but they don't show when I just look at them with my naked eye, which is pretty frustrating. Maybe it's just because I'm able to zoom in much closer with the macro function on the camera. So you can see, still got some scratches there, but I'm going to let them go and we'll see what happens. I'll attach the 4000 grit sponge to my super fancy little sanding tool here. This is just a chunk of epoxy sculpt that I've molded to kind of fit between my thumb and finger around a piece of plastic and then stuck some Velcro on it. And it's a great little tool when I want to do this by hand. Okay, so you can see how nice and satiny that is. I mean, it's even starting to pick up a little bit of sheen on its own just from the 4000 grit. So that is a good place to jump into polishing. And I'm super curious to see how this goes with this new polishing compound that I'm going to try. It's supposed to be relatively aggressive, so it'll be nice to see if it takes out those scratches. But this is a good illustration of why it's important to be real disciplined with your sanding. I mean, you can see that even though I made the right progression as I worked my way up, that I still ended up with some scratches there. And I think that the reason that happened is because with my last pass with the 3000 grit, I flipped it around to the other end of the paper that was brand new. And I think it was just a little too aggressive, and that's probably why I have those scratch marks. But I don't see any over here. So as long as I get one section of this thing that gives me a good polish, then I'll basically be able to make my conclusions about what I'm doing here. Okay, so I don't normally do this stuff at night, but I am super curious to see how this is going to polish out. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one side of the tape with Zam, and then tomorrow I'll do the other side of the tape with the new stuff. So this will kind of be the baseline. As you can see, I've got a wheel here that's not brand new, but not totally whipped either. So all you do with Zam is you just do this. Whoops. So you get the wheel nice and loaded up with it. And I'm running this thing pretty fast. It goes to 20, I've got it on 10. Okay, here we go. Let's see what happens. So you might not think that looks too bad, but I'm really not happy with it. it's still a little bit wavy, and part of it is because of those panel lines that are running across there, but it's also because there's still some micro scratches in there. So I don't know. I'm not totally stoked. It is better though than what I've been experiencing with U-POL. So I'm gonna just keep working at it, see how it shakes out. Okay, so I'll take another look at this tomorrow in the daylight and see what I think of it. How I feel right now is that it's pretty straight. In other words, it's not wavy. You know, when you look at the reflection of the egg crate in my task lamp, all the lines are straight. So that at least is good. But even though it looks pretty good, there is still some fuzziness there. And that's because there's just a really, really fine sort of, it's almost like a super, super fine orange peel in there. And I don't know what's causing that. But it's not perfectly glass smooth like I was hoping for. Again, it's better than what I've been getting, but I don't think it's as good as I should be able to get. So we'll see what happens tomorrow with the new Scholl Concepts S3. Good morning, gangsters. It's time to get to work with some polishing. And last night where I left off, I was feeling a little bit dissatisfied because I just did not like the micro orange peel that I'm seeing right here on this little portion of my test sample. And just to confirm that that's exactly what I was seeing, it's the first thing I noticed when I looked at it this morning. So again, it's not bad. It's better than what I was getting with U-POL, but I'm still not happy with it. I did work it a little bit using some different things last night. I got after it with some of my blue Dialux, and that seemed to help a little bit, but not much. I tried a little bit of the old standby Novus heavy scratch remover. Didn't really seem to affect it, but I used that over here, and I did a little bit of it by hand, and then I did it with the Proxon. So I don't know. Here, my theory is, and this is 100% speculation, is that maybe it gets a little warm while you're polishing it, and it starts to move around a little bit, and that's where that texture comes from. And I don't know. I mean, that, looking at it on camera, that reflection looks awesome. So I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see what I'm talking about and why I'm dissatisfied with it. There it is. You can see it when I do the reflection of the of my task lamp, and you get more contrast between the bright and the dark. You can see, let me get closer if I can get the angle right. It's hard for the camera to focus on the reflection. And that's kind of the thing when you're looking at this. You have to look through the paint surface, if that makes sense, and focus on the reflection. But maybe you can see there, even though the reflection is blurry because the camera won't focus on it, that it's got a little bit of softness to it. It's straight, but I don't know. It's frustrating. and it's a subtle thing, but it can make a huge difference. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this piece of tape and get after this with this miracle polishing juice that Senor Carlos is such a big fan of, and we'll see what happens. See if we like the results any better. If I can get this piece of tape unwound here so that I can recycle it, because we like to recycle here at Rube Goldberg. Okay, so there we go. Now let's look at this. Let's look at this stuff. Get some of these other things out of the way. All right, so here's what we've got. Scholl Concepts S3 Gold XXL. Hey, it's German efficiency, so this should be great. Extra heavy cut, and you can see they've got a little bit of a chart here on the side that shows you that the S3 is somewhere in the middle of the heavy range, so I'm not sure how it is extra heavy cut. It seems like the S0 would be the extra heavy, but yeah, whatever. We're going to see what happens. Hopefully, let's see. Oh, that's great. Okay. Well, apparently there was a little bit of pressure inside that bottle from shipping, because when I opened it, it exploded all over the shelf, all over me, all over my workbench. There's even a blob of it up inside my task lamp. I mean, yeah, this looks like the set of something you'd see on Pornhub right now. I'll let you guys figure that joke out. Anyway, my concerns about getting some out of the bottle easily are resolved. I've got more than enough all over everything to work with. So let's see. I'm going to just grab a little cup here and park this in it. And after I sort of get things cleaned up here a little bit, I'll get after the polishing. And believe it or not, even with my lousy level of sensation in my fingers, I can kind of feel the grit in that. So we'll see. I really hope this stuff is the miracle cure for my polishing angst that Carlos thinks it is, because I am severely frustrated by my inability to solve this problem. That does not make me a happy camper. No. Now, I'm going to switch to a relatively clean buffing wheel, because I don't want to get any of the other stuff mixed in with this. So there we go. For those of you who are wondering, these buffing wheels, I get them on Amazon. They're just Dremel yellow cloth buffing wheels, and they're pretty cheap. You get a whole bag of them for like $5. So here we go. Let's polish. I also have slowed the polisher down a little bit. I'm running it at like 5 or 7, whatever that means on this Proxxon. I'm not really sure that makes any difference, but given that I was theorizing about it heating up, I thought it might make sense to do that. Okay, so this is interesting. This stuff is definitely aggressive. I think if you look at this, you can see that the polish is pretty straight, but it looks a little cloudy. And that's because it is it's leaving some scratch marks that even I can see with my just looking at it with my glasses on. They're not horrible, but they are definitely there. And when I look at it, when I really focus on that reflection, and the angle where I can see it is a little bit different than it is from what the camera can see. So I feel like this is not leaving that micro orange peel that the other stuff is, but it's still not a perfectly glass smooth surface. And I don't know, maybe what I'm learning here is that that's just too much to hope for. Maybe that's, maybe that right there is just the best you get. I don't know. But one thing is for certain is that this would not be good enough for a final polish. And some of the guys that I've looked at who are using this stuff since Carlos recommended it are using another step to, I guess, get a finer cut. So Carlos initially told me that this was a single step thing, but I'm not sure that you could use it for that, just based on what I'm seeing here. Let me try to get the angle right where you guys on camera can see the same thing I'm seeing. See, still a little bit cloudy, but not bad. I mean, at least it's nice and straight, that's for sure. Now, Carlos has also told me that he is using a sealer and a wax. Of course, he tells me all of this stuff after I've already gone and bought one thing thinking that's all I need. So I don't know, but he says he's going from this to the sealer and then the wax. So what I'm gonna do, since that seems like a pretty heavy cut, is I'm going to try a couple of more things to see if now I can get an even finer finish on that. So let's try a little bit of this Novus, because it seems to be less aggressive, even though it's the heavy scratch remover in the Novus family. You guys can see why I quit using Novus. I mean, the stuff just splatters everywhere. It makes a mess. Now, if I have to, if that's the sacrifice that's required to get the finish that I want, then so be it. But that's why I started using rouge, because it's just much less of a hassle. Okay, I think you guys can see that is definitely an improvement though. I mean, that took it from what it looks like over here to that. I mean, that looks pretty damn good right there. I mean, I am not unhappy with that. And I don't, let's see if I can get the same reflection that I had earlier when I walked in here. I don't immediately have the same sort of micro orange peel look that was annoying me about the other. So now I guess what I'll do, since I already went down the path of getting out the Novus, I'll get the Novus number 2 and we'll see what happens. It's probably clogged up as well. Nope, got lucky. So there we go. Little Novus number 2. More of a mess, but hey, I've already got polishing compound all over me, so no big deal. Now notice I'm changing directions as much as possible, because again, you always want to try and work across the scratch marks from the previous step. And I'm just focusing on this area where I've got the purple rose or black rose or whatever it's called, because that's where the reflections are easiest to look at. Black paint, or really any really dark color, is the toughest thing to get straight because it is such a good reflector. Okay, there we go. That is pretty damn good. I can still see some slight little ridges in there, but it's much better than what I was doing. Let me take this piece of tape off of here so we can look at both sections at the same time. And I think this will be pretty telling. Here we go. Now, hopefully I'll be able to get the camera angle good for this. Watch what happens as I rotate this and it goes from the section I just did over to the section that I did last night. See the difference? That is pretty crispy right there. And a little less crispy. I mean, look, you wouldn't kick that out of bed right there, but this is way, way further down the road. That's what I want. That is what I'm after right there. So, there we go. I'm going to keep tinkering with this and come to some final conclusions, but I think you guys can kind of see what's going on. What I'm going to do also now today is I'm going to go after this piece right here and see what I get out of it. You can see, I mean, this again is not a bad finish. I have sprayed 2K urethane gloss clear and just left it like that, where I didn't polish it, because honestly, it looks pretty good. I mean, this is still better than about 90% of the gloss finishes you see in scale modeling, just without any further work. But that unpolished urethane has a certain look to it. It's a little bit plasticky looking. It's a little bit, some people say it's a little toy-like, and that may be true. It just kind of depends on the situation. Like on my RC213V, I didn't polish any of it, and I think it looks pretty good. But those are smaller surfaces, and it's just, I just felt like when I looked at it that it was okay. Would it have looked better if I'd polished it out? Yeah, sure, but was it worth the effort? Nah, I didn't think so at the time. So what I'm going to do with this one anyway is I'm going to do the sanding with my Proxxon pin sander, which I'll have to be careful with. Obviously, I don't want to burn through it, but I think it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Okay, time to get after it with some power tools. I have my Proxxon pin sander, which is a wonderful little instrument. It's kind of an angry little machine, but it's actually pretty controllable. And I've been experimenting with it a lot and found that I can do some cool stuff with it. It comes with these different plastic attachments, and I use double-sided tape or double-sided Velcro to sort of customize it. And then sometimes I'll stick pieces of sanding sponge to it. That's what I had on here, and sometimes I'll just put a piece of paper on it. I actually used it to do all of the sanding on this thing. And just to give you an idea of what I was up against, the top side looked a lot like that. What happened with this piece is it was a paint mule I'd used before, and I decided to strip it, so I put it in brake fluid, which was fine. Brake fluid doesn't harm polystyrene. But then for some silly reason, I thought I should degrease the brake fluid. I wasn't thinking about the fact that brake fluid is hygroscopic, and you can just wash it off with water and then, use some soap just to make sure. And I thought I needed to use something a little more, degreaser-like, and I was going to get some mineral spirits, and then I saw my can of turpentine that I never use, and so I just grabbed it. Well, it was kind of a happy accident because I learned that's something that surprised me, which is that turpentine is strong enough to do things like that to plastic. I mean, it totally wrecked it. And it was kind of silly, but I didn't want to throw this away because it was a good paint mule. And so I decided to see how much of it I could sand out and what my little pin sander would do for me. And knowing that I was going to be doing the gravity paint test, what it would take to get it up to a decent finish. So I think that's kind of cool because you can see that I went from that to that relatively simply. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do. Now, I always use this pin sander with water because it moves plenty fast enough to overheat things if you're not careful. And obviously, without a real pliable sponge on it, you also can pretty quickly burn through any thin coating. So I'm just gonna get after it. I'm gonna move pretty fast, and I'm gonna go through all three of the grades of sandpaper that I have, and then I'll switch the end piece, and I'll go to these sponges, and we'll see what that gets me. Okay, so check it out. That was the whole process using power tools, which I love. And I think you have to agree that's pretty impressive. I mean, that's all just sanding right there. That little Proxxon pin sander gets after it. I mean, it's certainly much faster and much less tiresome than doing it by hand. Now, obviously, it's not going to work in every situation. I mean, when you imagine, a model car body, you're not going to be able to get to every surface as easily as I am on something like this. But I think you can imagine the possibilities. I certainly will be trying it more in the future. But that's just not a bad finish right there. In fact, for some models, like if you were modeling paint that had been sprayed like in the 40s or 50s or whatever, before they invented all these super high gloss paints and fancy clear coats, you might consider that to be a pretty authentic finish for the time period. So I think this is a good base to start with for the polishing, which I'm going to do the same way that I did on the other piece. And you can see there's not any scratches in there. What I have found with the pin sander is that you can use a surprisingly coarse grit of abrasive and not get scratches because the thing is moving so fast. And as long as you keep it moving around the surface, it just doesn't have time to leave a gouge, which is nice, because those random scratches that I always seem to get when I'm sanding by hand are the thing that drives me nuts, because I can't ever seem to get them out as I work my way down the grit size progression. So anyway, there we go. Time for some polishing. Okay, here we go. Last look at the test samples. I went ahead and did the polishing on this piece, and what I ended up doing was just running with the best method from the previous piece, which was that I used the Scholl S3 to do the first polish, and then I used the next. I used the number 3 and number 2 Novus. So maybe what Carlos is saying is true, and I should go ahead and get the other 2 compounds. He recommends the S17 and the S30 of the Scholl, and I may go ahead and get it, because one thing I like about it is that it's goopier than the Novus, and it doesn't fly around as much. I've got polishing compound all over me, which, it is what it is. Like I said, if that's the sacrifice that's necessary to get really good results, then so be it. But I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, if you look, that's pretty straight. There's not much, if any, waviness in it. When you get in really close, you can see that it's still pretty crisp. It's about like the other piece. It's not 100% perfectly glass smooth, and I may just have to accept that that's just not possible. I don't know. I'm not 100% certain that I'm doing everything right yet. This is one of those things where no matter how carefully you read the instructions and listen to other people tell you the steps and watch the demos on YouTube and all those things, you still have to put in the time to develop the method for yourself. And it's tough without an expert sitting right here looking over my shoulder telling me whether or not what I'm doing is right or wrong. So, but this is the best polishing effort that I've ever achieved. So at least I can say that much. And, we'll see what happens. I'm going to build something glossy later this year, and I'll be using these techniques. So we'll see how that works out. Now, I'm picking this piece back up because I did one extra step on it. I waxed it, which is something that I don't normally do because I just honestly haven't ever been able to decide that it was worth the effort. But I did have this Meguiar's liquid wax. I know people talk about stuff that's got carnauba, and I don't know what's best. I'm sure it's one of those things that, like everything dudes do, well, there's tons of arguments about it. Again, I don't know that it looks any better than it did before I waxed it. Certainly doesn't look bad. Looks pretty tight. So I don't know. Maybe that's the next thing I gotta I gotta ask Carlos about, because he swears he uses a paint sealer and a wax. I'm not sure why you need a sealer, because it's not like we're going to take this out and drive it around in the rain. But, you know, again, if that's what it takes to get the kind of results he gets, then I'll do it. I mean, you know, bottom line is, if he told me that drinking boiled monkey piss was the path to a perfect gloss, I would do it. Okay, so there you go, dudes. Yet another absurdly long video, but not only do I feel like I had to cover a lot to accomplish what I set out to, but it's just one of those things. I mean, this is the kind of work that just takes time. If you think the video is long, you should have been sitting here in real time while I was actually doing the work. You know, polishing is just something I've learned is one of those things where there's no substitute for time and elbow grease. And it's a process where I feel like there are details and subtleties and nuances that are just not really adequately covered in a 10-minute video that says, okay, first you sand, and then you polish, and then you wax, and then you're done. So, I don't know, it kind of is what it is. I feel like I've learned some things with this test. My conclusion is that you definitely should give your 2K clear 4 or 5 days to fully harden. I always thought the stuff was fully hardened after just a couple of days, but apparently that is not the case. So that is probably the single most important thing that I've learned. I've also learned that my preferred and beloved polishing rouges may not be the best thing. I'm still going to continue to use them for polishing things like clear parts. But, you know, for polishing a clear coat, they may not be the best thing. I started using them because they make a lot less mess. But, again, that just may have to be the sacrifice that gets made for that perfect gloss. So I will be using this Scholl S3 on my next shiny thing. I'm pretty impressed with it. I think it's better than Novus. It's kind of a pain in the ass because it seems like you can only get a huge bottle of it, and it's like $50. I mean, there's enough in that bottle to do a lifetime's worth of models. So you might want to get together with some of your car model buddies if you have some, and you know, split it 3 ways or something. I don't know. That would definitely make it better. I think I'm going to go ahead and get the S17 so that I've got that next stage of compound, because it definitely, I feel like you've got to have that to get, you know, things to their full potential. I may start doing the sealer and the wax like Carlos says. I don't know. We'll see. You know, I feel like there's just can't be any compromises when it comes to this kind of finish. So I'll do whatever I have to do. Anyway, I hope you guys found that useful and informative. I know that getting a super glossy finish is pretty intimidating for understandable reasons for a lot of model makers, and I hope you can see that it's really not so much that it's hard in terms of skill as it is just in terms of effort. So there you go. Anyway, if you stayed through the whole thing, I definitely appreciate it. Much love.